Come to me, all you who are labored and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy and my burden light. Every time I hear that passage, it takes me back to my childhood. I've shared with you before that my stepfather was born and raised on a farm in North Iowa. And I remember in my childhood we would go to that home farm very often, on most weekends. And it was a working farm, and they had this large barn. And I remember when I would go into that barn, on one of the walls was this, what I remember was a huge harness. Well made. Even as a boy, I noticed how well crafted it was, made of wood and leather and metal. It was made for the workhorse from a time that went past or before the tractor. Whenever you would see that, it would remind you of that time before the tractor. And how they would make those harnesses. And as a boy, I remember it being so large, that it would go over the neck and the shoulder area of the horse, and made it so that it would fit very well and comfortably. That was a time when they would use the horses to pull the plow and to pull the wagon, or pull out the old tree stumps to clear the land. When Jesus said, "My yoke is easy, my burden light," it makes me think of that particular illustration, that image in my mind, because the word easy, we have a different notion of than what it was intended, because what Jesus meant that word from the Greek was easy to put on. In fact, the word more specifically means well-fitted. It fits very well. In other words, Jesus is saying, my yoke is well-fitted. It fits well. When the yoke was made back in Jesus' time, they had to take the measurements of the oxen. The yoke was for oxen. It would go over the shoulders. And they would have to measure the oxen first, and then they would do the general, kind of measurements, and then kind of get the general instrument made, and then they'd have to bring back the oxen to get the fine tuning. They would custom make these contraptions so that it wouldn't rub the wrong way on the oxen. It wouldn't cause any abrasions or problems, that it would fit comfortably when they would have to pull the load. And in Christian Midrash, they say, this is a legend, but they say that when Jesus was learning the craft of carpentry from Joseph, that people from all over would come to their workshop to get their yokes made because they were very good at it. And that there was a sign above the workshop saying, "Our yokes fit well." So that Jesus perhaps was recalling, he was hearkening back to those times in his younger years when he began his public ministry. That kind of advertisement that they had, now he was using it as a sort of slogan for the spiritual life during his public ministry. He was saying, my yoke is easy. My yoke fits well in the spiritual life. My burden is light. How could this burden be light? Because the rabbis, they would often use the symbol of the yoke as a symbol of submission. You submit to the law, you submit to the commandments, and so they would use the yoke as a symbol. The yoke of the law, the yoke of the commandments, the yoke of the kingdom, the yoke of God. You submit to these things. You submit to this burden, this obligation this responsibility, this heavy weight, because it's individual. But Jesus is turning this around, giving us a different perspective when he says, my burden is light. How can it be light? Well, let's go back to the barn. When I would go into that barn and I would see that harness that was built for a workhorse, I remember Uncle Spur. That was my stepfather's brother. Now, mind you, both of them were born, Uncle Spur was born in 1901, and my stepdad was 1905. So when they looked at that harness, they remember a time when those were actually used. And I remember one time Uncle Spur said to me, you know, when old Wilbur, when we would put that harness on him and strap him up, Charlie would be out in the field, and he could be at the very corner of the far of the field. But when he saw Wilbur being strapped up, he would trot on over, and he would come right alongside Wilbur. It was almost as if Charlie felt bad for Wilbur, and that he couldn't bear the thought of that his friend would have to pull the plow alone. I never forgot that. I thought, hey, maybe I could use that for a homily, huh? And that's what Jesus basically is saying, in my own warped way of understanding this. Jesus is saying, look, life can be hard. It can be challenging. It can be difficult. There's struggles, especially if it's individual, if you're doing it alone. But Jesus turns it around and says, look, I'm not saying harness. I'm saying yoke. A yoke is built for two. I want to hold up this burden with you. Not only that, I want to hold up the brunt of the burden with you. I want to pull this burden with you so that you're not alone, that it's not overwhelming, so that the harness fits you well and you're not overwhelmed, that the burden is light because I'm with you. If you would just come. That's the message for all of us today. Don't bear the brunt alone. May the Lord then give us that grace to respond to our Lord's call. Jesus is calling us. Come to me, all you who are labored and are burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for yourselves. For my yoke is easy, and my burden light.